Hi, this is Robert Shear with another edition of Shear Intelligence, which is actually an arrogant title given to me by NPR station in Santa Monica, and but I live with it, and then I say the intelligence comes from my guest. In this case, Omar Zahzah, an assistant professor of Arab Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies in the Department of Race and Resistance Studies at San Francisco State University. Now, I give that whole long title just to show that Professor Omar Zaza is probably a target of the new witch hunt. I don't want to curse him or anything here. He's got all the credentials. He's got a doctorate from UCLA, highly educated. He's originally Lebanese Palestinian descent. He's really qualified to talk about what we want to talk about, which is primarily what has happened on the internet, what has happened to the media coverage of the Palestinian Israeli issue, and so forth. And he's written a compelling book, Terms of Servitude. I love that title because it's a play on terms of service, right, regarding the internet. He's right up there in the belly of the beast of Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and so forth. Terms of servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and digital settler colonialism in the Palestinian liberation struggle. Another mouthful, but let's concentrate on terms of servitude because really he makes a point. The book is of compelling interest, I think, as an examination of the media's coverage or failure to cover the Palestinian issue and the atrocious intrusion and censorship on the whole debate and the denial of genocide and everything else. So that's you can have that discussion. We will, but the larger discussion I want to have, and I'm taking you to be uh, maybe more expert than I am. I did write a book. They know everything about you, and I spent quite a bit of time in Silicon Valley. But I must say, I learned from your book and I learned, and there's an honest admission at the beginning of this book, which is anytime you write about the internet, you're going to be almost out of date or somewhat out of date, no matter what happens when it gets published. It's a fast moving target or phenomena and covers its tracks quite effectively. They have great PR people. When you suggest they may have done this wrong or that wrong, they have a whole alternative explanation and so forth. They're very good at justifying whatever they do as being in the name of civilization. But your book makes a compelling case that we're not in our father's internet anymore. That there was a time when the internet was sort of the Wild West, and there was a lot of freedom, a lot of libertarian freedom in the name of capitalism. We have to have different views. We have to protect our market. We have to protect our consumers. All of that is gone now under congressional pressure, state pressure, all over the world. All governments all over the world lie, and all governments all over the world want to control the debate. And this book makes a powerful case using the Palestinian Israeli issue that the internet is a tightly controlled game now. And I want to begin with that and let you take it over now and tell me how you make this case in the book. And, and unfortunately, I think it's all too accurate. And you have very famous now internet players, Larry Ellison and his son now own CBS. Who knows? CNN is up for sale. Everything's up for sale. And so the internet now is the old media, the new media, but it's run by a handful, maybe too large, but billionaires, and they have very strong political views and economic interests and self-serving. And so we're gone from the internet in some ways being the best of all worlds, now being the worst of all worlds. Take it away, Professor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad you started with that question because a large part of what motivated me to write the book, obviously, I'm concerned with the specificity of how these evolutions in digital technology impact the Palestinian struggle. But another aspect of what I was reacting to was also how Palestine in general seems not to figure in very much into the more mainstream tradition of writing that is critical of big tech or kind of keeping a watchful eye on big tech, right? It's not to say that nobody touches it ever, but in terms of the actual scale to which Palestine is relevant for these questions, I definitely don't think that the output reflects that convergence, right? And so Your question kind of reminds us, I think, that issues even about the current conditions of the internet, the loss of net neutrality, the kind of transformation pretty rapidly of this space into essentially a site for data mining and surveillance and targeted advertisement from what we saw in the very beginning, where there's a little bit more potential in terms of these new forms of communications technology, right? Um, Palestine is not exceptional. It's one example of how that broader trend is disastrous for all people, for the actual authentic transmission of reliable critical information that doesn't capitulate to hegemonic forces. So all that's to say, definitely the loss of a people-powered internet is of vital importance to the question of Palestine, because part of the reason that you start to have the undermining of the transmission of actual critical messaging about the Palestinian struggle that's countering what for the longest time had been the arch censor, which is the legacy corporate media. The internet initially provided the opportunity to be able to do that for Palestinians and for their allies. And we've seen increasingly with the corporatization of the platforms that made some of those transitions possible that that tendency obviously is dissolving, and that's by design. So I think the I guess I would say the framework that you're setting up in that question is really the one that I hope people will read the book with, because on the one hand we do want to see how is all of this impacting Palestinians and their allies, but on the other hand, how are the broader destructive trends in big tech and in the evisceration of the potential for the internet to be something that is truly critical, how is that disastrous for all people, right? And when you follow that trajectory, obviously Palestine is simply one example out of many. We should all be opposed to this for a plethora of reasons.
Well, let me broaden that subject. The saving, look, there's a whole issue. Is capitalism good for
Hmm.
freedom? And you're up there close to Silicon Valley, you're at San Francisco State, and the illusion of that was put out, and an illusion backed by a certain amount of reality, is that in the early stages of the internet, the libertarians held sway, and even some of them were very famous and rich. Even Peter Thiel called himself a libertarian, and the cause of the libertarian was used to disguise an attempt to prevent any regulation in the old Adam Smith sense of having an invisible hand, having a free market. The construction of the internet is a denial of the free market. It's actually a denial of the libertarian ideal from its inception. It began as a Defense Department. For those who
Hmm.
want to know more about it, I recommend my own book. They know everything about you. Basically, it was a Defense Department construction to have technology that could survive a nuclear blast. So you had the packets and decentralized technology that evolved into the internet. And the charm of it was, and the appeal of it was, it would be difficult to censor. It would be open ended, open source, and so forth. And much was made of it, but the argument that the Clinton administration bought into, along with the normally uh, pro-capitalist Republicans, was that it was a special thing, and it couldn't be subject to the normal anti-monopoly regulation,
Hmm.
right? And so, as a result, we came with a new form of monopoly and cartels, where Facebook and Google and Apple are able to buy up their competitors, prevent competition, and that's all protected as a matter of law. They're also able to use people's communication, information, privacy, all of that went by the board because this would make them more effective. The justification was it's a neutral means. It's like delivering
Yeah.
water or electricity, so you want it to be efficient. Well, that crashes to the ground when one of the big, Oracle leader happens to be the fervently pro-Zionist and supports Netanyahu, and he's now not only has the internet a big chunk of it, but he has now CBS, and its parent company and so forth as his son running it, And so, wait a minute, suddenly we're in a situation where you want to have regulation of monopoly cartels, first of all, so you have competing sources of profit and preserve a free market, but also so you can have a political society that is, after all, the definition of fascism is, as we saw in Germany, when BMW and Mercedes lined up with Hitler, and suddenly capitalist production and fascism, Nazism are co-sympathizers. We're at a critical moment here because you have Donald Trump bringing in all these Silicon Valley. They kiss his ass, and
Hmm.
everything is wonderful. So the brilliance of the libertarian idea, which I think is valid as a concept, fantasy anyway, which is that the private sector will keep us free because the invisible hand of Adam Smith is no one company controls information. That's why it's invisible. It's the market. It's the consumers. Is out. That's out to lunch. It's gone. And so yes, Palestine is a very good example, but it applies all throughout the world. China can tell Apple what to do or Google if they want to come in. They're still not in China. So can Russia, so can Saudi Arabia. So all over the world, you have these governments can game the internet and ensure their profit, but not their freedom for their consumers who really aren't consumers anyway because they're getting it for nothing, but they're giving up their private data. Short editorial on my part. So I found your book very powerful because it's taking obviously a major moral crisis, which is whether you use the word genocide or not, I will use the word genocide, but
Hmm.
certainly a very severe assault on the lives of people living in their historic area called Palestinians who are moved around, who are destroyed as a culture, every university wiped out, every school wiped out, the rights of 6 year olds to life and liberty or 3 year olds is eliminated. They can be shot on sight and so forth. One of the most, maybe the most compelling example of an attack on civilians since the Holocaust, not to trivialize the Holocaust, but the fact of the matter is, this is all now, and this is what I got out of your book, being abetted.
Hmm.
So let's go to case study. Being abetted by Silicon Valley's treatment of this major moral crisis, human rights crisis. So take us through the details. What is Silicon Valley doing, and what have you shown in your book?
Thank you. And a lot to work with there. And right before I give a direct answer to this question, I just want to do a little bit of a shameless plug because you're right to bring up Ellison and TikTok and Oracle. And I just wanted to let your listeners know that I've just had a piece come out in Electronic Intifada that was about the TikTok deal and what that means for the struggle. So either we can go into that in a little bit, or maybe your listeners
Go
will
into
want
it
to check
right
that
now.
out.
Go into it right now because we've been so general. Bring us into your book, okay? Enough of my babbling here.
All right. Well, so I'll say a couple of things. First, I'm going to start with two general contentions, okay? And one of those is that maybe the fact that the internet, as you rightfully note in your historical overview, kind of always began in close proximity to the military industrial complex, maybe that always indicated that we were going to end up at a place related to where we are now. And secondly, of course, the problem also is capitalism itself, because this industry working at, in this for-profit formation whereby the consolidation of interests with the military industrial complex, with the imperial status quo is always going to be ultimately incentivized, I think is always going to lead us down very dangerous paths. So perhaps it was always inevitable that we would end up where we are, even if the exact configuration was somewhat up in the air. But the what we're seeing right now with the TikTok deal and just the intense, uh, a lot of people use that word media consolidation to talk about how all these industries get kind of combined under the same, broad umbrella. But right now, we're seeing the consolidation both of some of the biggest names in the digital sphere vis-a-vis the TikTok app, and then also, of course, with some of the strongest names in corporate legacy media vis-a-vis CBS, and this is, of course, respectively through Larry Ellison, who's the co-founder of the data storage company Oracle, and his son David, right, who now has CBS, made Barry Weiss the editor in chief, and they bought out her free press for, I believe, $150 million. So, what I talked about in the book, and as a way of drawing a path to where we are now, is essentially how these big tech companies that had initially, or whose platforms I should say, had initially been very instrumental in allowing for Palestinians and their allies to advance new narratives about the Palestinian struggle that challenged the old propaganda we would see time and time again in corporate legacy media, um, about how rather than being an anti-colonial struggle, this is about coexistence, or this is about two peoples who've struggled for thousands of years, those types of talking points that people who have an actual sophisticated understand really doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of what's happening. In around 2021, you start to see Palestinians taking to social media, to talk about what at the time is their impending expulsion from the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Part of how they create more attention is through the savvy use of social media. And what happens at this moment in time, especially because globally, media has been primed culturally through the 2020 George Floyd uprisings, and all of a sudden you see, whether or not this leads to material attention, that's a separate issue, but you at least start to see more of an interest and a willingness to entertain conversations about structural oppression in terms of racism, in terms of white supremacy. And so by the time you see this output from Palestinians in 2021 going into 2022, the culture at large is a little bit more receptive to reconsiderations of just what's happening when it comes to Palestine. And so these activists, including people like Muhammad al-Kurd, the poet and the journalist, who are starting to advance narratives about this is a settler colonial process, right? All of a sudden, that starts to land. They start to be platformed increasingly more, and not just in terms of the digital media, but also on corporate legacy media outlets like CNN. Giving increasing time to speak about their struggle from their perspective, which is a critical anti-colonial perspective that becomes more and more normalized. And yet, you know, all of a sudden, the very sources that had, lent themselves out to be tools to challenge the hegemonic narrative, all of a sudden start to reverse the process or try to, right? And you start to see this massive censorship of posts about Sheikh Jarrah, for example, or the bombing of Gaza that takes place at that time in 2022, so on and so forth, to the extent that it becomes very apparent that Palestinians and people posting about these things are being massively censored in various ways, right? Whether it's having their accounts suspended or deleted, their posts taken down, you know, it becomes so pronounced that you actually see legacy media beginning to report on this, right? Like, why are there so much censorship of posts about Sheikh Jarrah by platforms like Meta platforms, Facebook and Instagram, or by Twitter, which we now is known as X, right? And of course, the companies officially say, well, we're just experiencing a glitch. This is, not an intentional policy. Of course, what we've seen happen over the years is that these anti-Palestinian forms of content moderation have become very streamlined and normalized in these platforms. And I'm talking about the prominent big tech platforms, again, like Facebook, Instagram, or even X, and so the book basically was a response to both that normalization as well as an attempt to kind of ask the question of, what happens at this moment in time where we've seen the normalization of such rampant forms of censorship in platforms that, again, had initially allowed for people to kind of strike back at hegemonic modes of understanding Palestine, right? What do we do with the impasse that we're at, and what are the broader implications of that for the Palestinian struggle? That's essentially what the book was looking at. And again, working from the periods of 2021 up to our just a little bit before this moment in time of which we're speaking now, 2025, following about 2 years of genocide. That's the time span that the book covered. And again, looking at this question of what do we do now that we have such a normalized censorship? But again, to bring it back to the Ellison TikTok deal, right? Some of the trends that I had talked about we're seeing being confirmed. You have those who have a vested interest in maintaining the imperialist status quo are acting upon, new forms of consolidating control over forms of media that had initially been instrumental to people being able to speak back to power, right? Um, TikTok, of course, and I talk about this in the book, had its issues even before this current phase of the TikTok deal. So, but I think it's still troubling to see this current deal coming to pass in the way that it is, because we're seeing a very stark consolidation of different forms of media under a very explicitly pro-Israel banner. So it's very, I think it's very clear that we're about to see, even more escalating forms of censorship about the Palestinian struggle in this moment.
Well, I don't want to trivialize that struggle, but the danger is really much wider because, in fact, my own feeling is the Palestinian struggle can't be just eliminated
Mhm.
because where U.S. One strength that Donald Trump has, as opposed to the more warmongering Democrats, is that he knows it is a multipolar world. He has had to negotiate for his hotels. He's had to worry about things happening. And so there's actually a more realistic view of what the world is now. You can't just ban China and isolate it, because you also have India to worry about. He's got a big tariff on India. There's Brazil to worry about. They can produce and they can sell soy, beans and so forth to China instead of the Midwest. So he recognizes this is a world to be negotiated in. And in that world, what we saw at the UN just a matter of weeks ago is that the overwhelming majority of nations in the world will not accept the elimination of the Palestinians. It's just for a whole series of historic reasons, not the least of which is that a good number of those people can't get into the Muslim uh, denigration that anybody, and not all Palestinians are Muslims, but I mean, you can't just dismiss people because they might be or are, and in the recognition that nationalism goes a lot of different ways, and you can't just disregard every UN decision, everything that has been ever said, and so there is pressure and you see it now. We have to worry about Egypt. We have to worry about Saudi Arabia. We have to worry about all these other players. What I'm concerned about, not to play down the Palestinian concern, which, by the way, translates into an Israeli Palestinian and Israeli Jewish concern, because as a Jewish person, I don't like being associated with genocide in my name, and I feel strongly about not in my name, but I'm not playing down that issue. But what I'm saying is it's worldwide because it affects, for instance, what is your relation to China and India and Brazil and so forth? And what can you get away with? What concessions can you make? What is the role of the dollar? I don't want to go into all of these issues, but your book, because you had some concern, you were writing this book before the attack on the kibbutz in Israel, and you're worried in the book, in fact, is to what degree does this stay fresh? It stays very fresh because you're dealing with this issue of the internet and freedom. That I just want to keep bringing it back to that because
Mhm.
what you're really talking about right now, does China have the right to make chips that are more advanced? Do they have the right to abandon making T-shirts and be high tech? It's India, the same thing. In India, after all, they produce a lot of the engineers where you live in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Well, maybe those people can stay home and outcompete Cupertino or something in production. This is a big worldwide issue. Who gets out of the middle income trap? Who gets to make finished goods and or engage in the green revolution as China is leading the green revolution now? Who gets to benefit from that? And so you have, most recently, Saudi Arabia undermined the effort to control Russia because they didn't undermine their oil price, and Russia is allied with OPEC and so forth. And it seems to me the big issue here is who gets to call the shots. And ironically, on foreign policy, not domestic, because Trump is big on finding domestic enemies to replace the foreign enemies. But on internationally, he seems to be more realistic about what you can get away with, not get away with. These companies are playing a unique role here. They like the trade, they like the commerce, right? And I want to bring it back to that. On the other hand, they're not independent actors. They can be pushed around. Even Elon Musk was pushed around by Trump. There's a limit to his power. He was expendable, you know. And I would like you to, as a professor, considerable education, to examine this phenomena about power in the world and the right of ordinary people to weigh in any way. And I just offer an example. We talk a lot about democracy,
Hmm.
and there's a real question. Putin is now an anti communist. He ran against the Communist Party. Ironically, he's closer to China now than when Russia was communist. They couldn't get along at all. They shot at each other. They had a Sino Soviet war going. But the irony is the model of democracy that Trump is pushing in the world embraces Putin's Russia. It embraces Saudi Arabia. It embraces lots of, it doesn't matter whether they are, to what degree they're totalitarian, to what degree they protect dissent. That's besides the point. The question is, do they have power? Can we make a deal? Right?
Hmm.
And so I think in your book, you raise a fundamental question about where is freedom. Now you anchor it with the Palestinian concern. Do they have agency? Do they have rights? Something almost no one ever brings up. Do they have one person, one vote? This is, after all, the Palestinians did not cause the Six-Day War. They did not attack Israel. They did not have army. They didn't have arms. They were occupied by Jordan and Egypt. Those countries got along fine with Israel after it. So basically, we're talking about what is the role of individual freedom, whether it's a Palestinian, whether it's a Chinese person wanting to form a union, whether it's an intellectual in Russia trying to write a book that Putin doesn't like, all of which Trump is happy with the suppression. So the new model that's emerging out of Silicon Valley is light years away from the libertarian model that they gave voice to. On the contrary, it's a state capitalism
Hmm.
that they're embracing. And China itself is moving towards a state capitalism. Yes, a communist party, but in serious negotiation with Alibaba and all these other companies, and inviting in more foreign investment. So I would like you to put on your professor hat here, and because it's something that your book discusses actually more in a more interesting way than anything I've read in a long time. That, wait a minute, this is a different world now. And, if you think of something like the old class struggle that Karl Marx talked about, fact is we're now in an age of robotics. We're an age of AI. The conceit of Silicon Valley is we don't need working people. That's one reason you can kick out our immigrant population. We can replace them and so forth. So, as I say, I'm taking too much time. I want to end this certainly within 12 minutes. I keep it to 40 minutes. Why don't you take the podium here and give us your broad picture, arising with the examples from your book and why people should read? Let me state again: Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, Indigenous Settler Colonialism, and the Palestine Liberation Struggle. Let me change the title: Terms of Servitude. What is the role of freedom, if any, in this modern world? Freedom of the individual.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question on so many levels. And I mean, the picture is very concerning because I think as your setup really got us to, we're basically seeing the entrenchment of power on so many levels, right? State power, corporate power, and at the direct expense of the individual ability to challenge or speak back to that power. Um, I think the issue fundamentally is that we're seeing this generally unregulated industry now in this current regime, really looking to lock down its interests and its expansions even more. Again, we talked about Ellison and TikTok, but in general, like Silicon Valley as an industry is really looking to get as little regulation as possible through ingratiating itself with Trump. And we've seen all of these officials on various levels try to do it. Now, you talked about Musk and some of his misadventures. It's true, it's not necessarily limitless, but by and large, they seem to have caught on to this idea that the more we capitulate to Trump, the better it is for our interests. And the more it allows them to really expose their ultimate intentions, which of course have never really been in line with, protecting the interests or the speech or the power of people, even though they would pay lip service to that for their propaganda. So, where does that leave the individual now that we're at a moment where you're seeing the consolidation of these political projects at the international level, as well as the corporate consolidation domestically vis a vis this relationship with the Trump regime, which is also kind of working through this broader collaboration across, different strands of the right and the far right. Um, you know, I I'm going to say one thing that I realized in writing and then finishing the book is I became a lot less optimistic about platforms and technologies and a lot more optimistic about people. And what I realized is that even though we're at this moment where a lot of these platforms and these spaces have revealed themselves to be uh, a lot more anti-democratic, or just generally opposed to critical political expression than they first branded themselves out to be. It was never really about those platforms. It's always been about how people creatively repurpose them. Palestinians throughout history have proved themselves to be savvy and intentional appropriators of various forms of hegemonic media to great effect. And I think not just Palestinians, but people at large now in this moment, we all face the task of needing to really play into those tendencies in order to find newer and newer ways of speaking back to power. It's clear, right, just from skimming the headlines, you don't even have to read this all the way through, that the horizon of dissent is being intentionally shrunk for all of us. So, with that, we need to actually continue to think of new ways to be able to speak back and to challenge power, because they're always going to try to be one step ahead of us. I don't think they'll necessarily succeed, but in order for them not to succeed, we really need to be as creative and fluid in our resistance and in our activism and in our dissent against various forms of oppression as possible. So, I can't give you a blueprint on where that leaves the individual, but I think we definitely all have the responsibility to be as critical and creative as possible. And now more than ever, not take for granted some of the old tendencies that have worked so far, because it's clear that they're being locked down on. And so we need to continue to find new opportunities to showcase our resistance.
So let me switch finally the subject to something that at SharePost, where I'm the publisher, we're concerned about academic freedom. I happen to teach myself college, so I can only I was alive actually when Hitler came to power, but I was only 3 years old or two. But I was born into a family where this was a live issue. My mother was a Lithuanian Jewish woman who had come here after the Russian Revolution, was in the Jewish Socialist Bund. Two of her sisters had died fighting the Cossacks and then posed to the Bolsheviks at the end because they turned on her group. And they actually were the main people who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and took on the fascists and so forth. But my father also was from Germany and a Lutheran, and so I had to struggle with why did his people eliminate? Because when I went back to Lithuania, they all were dead and victims of this genocide. And my father's family by then they were working at the American Air Force Base and so forth, and getting along quite well with the Americans in free Germany, West Germany. So I've struggled with these questions, but at the heart of it was the capitulation of educated people.
Mm.
Because we have a lot of this Muslim baiting and Arab baiting and everything, and they're denigrated in Israel in the most jingoistic terms of subhuman and so forth. But the fact is that we want to talk about fascism. It came in the most enlightened nation by certainly the evaluation of Henry Ford or many Americans. German Americans were the largest immigrant group in this country. There were very few of them were Muslim. Most of them were Catholic or Protestant, overwhelmingly, and so the Holocaust, which we're not allowed to talk about in relation to Israel, and we're going to get to the academic freedom issues there of what is anti-Semitism, but nonetheless, the Holocaust was the work of people who claim to uh, have be informed by the Judeo-Christian ethic, at least the Christian ethic. They were killing the Judeo part of it then. And I want to dwell on that a bit because right now, someone like yourself is an endangered species.
Mhm.
That in fact, if you weren't in California, you wouldn't have a shot. So and you went. I want to bring up UCLA where you got your doctorate, and there are. I mean, I think of so many people that I've interviewed or know who came through the UCLA who are really our best. Juan Cole is certainly one
Yeah.
example as graduate, but there are others, many others, and yet UCLA behaved in a shameful way in the destruction of Palestinian resistance on the
Mhm.
campus, the actual hoodlums coming in and beating up people and so forth. So we have a few more minutes. Let's talk about the academic freedom issue and let's talk about UCLA, what's happening at the universities.
Mhm.
By the way, not to pick on UCLA, I teach at USC, our crosstown rival. They're not any better. They also called in the LAPD. But let's talk about this a little bit in the 4 minutes we have remaining.
Yeah. Yeah, I it's such an important question. I think I'll say very very quickly, one of the things I've really been seriously thinking through is, there's a lot that's made, of course, of, the Trump administration's like ultimatums and assaults on academic freedom and institutions. But there's a part of me that's also been seriously wondering, to what extent are institutions capitulating and to what extent are they actually collaborating? Because, even prior to Trump, even prior to what we saw under the Biden administration, universities in general have not wanted this type of activism or organizing for Palestine to flourish. And we'd seen cases, including the example of Stephen Salida in 2014, who was fired, from Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, for his tweets about the Israeli assault on Gaza. At that time, universities have always been hostile places to activism for Palestine, and even in certain cases, like individual speech and research on Palestine. And so, there's a part of me that wonders to what extent is this a result of, the exceptional political configurations of the moment, and to what extent are we actually seeing the evolution of natural institutional tendencies, which one of which has been all, this kind of long-standing hostility. But the issue now is that the Palestine question has become so fundamentally interlinked with other forms of academic freedom, precisely because it's kind of the Trojan horse that is being used to affect a lot of these attacks. So, but I think we can't talk about academic freedom without also frankly contending with the corporatization of the university system, and how that 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 tendency, right, that investment, or that concern, I should say, more with corporate investments or with keeping donors happy at the expense of faculty, at the expense of students. I think in a lot of ways we're sort of just reaping the harvest of that alliance. And so we need to continue to fight for academic freedom. I mean, I know we're kind of making jokes and I'm laughing about it, that wherever, you don't know how things are going to go. I think it's important for those of us to do what we can where we are. But part of the work can't just be, challenging this policy or that policy. Part of it fundamentally is, for as long as we still have them, we need to really be fighting to transform the university system, from this just the stock portfolio for a few wealthy administrators into something that actually genuinely uplifts and supports students and critical thought, and the free speech of its faculty, including and around the question of Palestinian liberation. So that's a process that's long in the works, and it's something we need to commit to well beyond what the current administration happens to be. Um, so I guess maybe it gets us back to what you were saying in the beginning. In a lot of ways, it's the problems of capitalism that we're also up against. But definitely, there's a lot of institutional rehabilitation that we need to be taking part in addition to fighting these actual direct political attacks and these witch hunts against individual faculty and students, and of course continuing to oppose shameful crackdowns, like, which by the way did not begin under Trump, which I'm not saying to throw Trump a bone, but the danger of exceptionalizing Trump is also ignoring how fundamentally bipartisan the commitment to repression of activism and organizing for Palestine really is. A lot of these, some of these police sweeps on campuses began under the Biden administration, and we saw some of these congressional hearings attacking people for how quote unquote opposed to anti-Semitism, meaning how much they actually would crack down on Palestine activism. That began under Biden, right? We need to fundamentally challenge the political status quo in this country, including the normalization of Palestinian death and dehumanization and subsequent policing and repression of activism that comes up as a result of that.
But to make it very personal, what happened in Germany was scholarship, respect for ideas, respect for logic, that became irrelevant. People like Herbert Marcuse couldn't exist. Albert Einstein couldn't exist, whether they were Jewish or not Jewish. Uh, they couldn't exist if they were outspoken and talking about truth, fact, or so
Mm-hmm.
forth. And that has been made fashionable here. Some of it can be blamed on, I guess, some people blame it on the woke culture, safe space, not making people uncomfortable, bringing up controversial matters or so forth, or debating them. But now it's gone full scale,
Yeah.
and your scholarship, in your case, you have all these degrees, all this work, all this study that will be used against you. I don't want to curse you in any way, but the fact is, that's not giving you any protection. Being right, being right doesn't give you any protection. This is what happened in Germany. It didn't matter that Hans Bethe, who wasn't Jewish, famous scientist and so forth, that felt if he speaks out, he has to leave Germany. Well, he worked on the bomb at Los Alamos. I interviewed Hans Bethe, many years after he talked about this, why he would leave Germany. So the whole idea, which is now fashionable almost, we can define anti Semitism as being critical of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anybody who is at all familiar with the Jewish tradition knows that being critical of of a state of any kind that declares itself the work of God is a sacrilege. I mean, this doesn't mean one could not defend it on a number of different reasons after what happened in World War II or so forth. But as a matter of this Jewish religion, the very idea that you presume to speak for an Almighty and the return of religious presence, I mean, it's obvious. Goes against what the whole idea of being Jewish is. That doesn't bother anybody. Certainly doesn't bother someone like Ellison at all.
Yeah.
He knows. He what is he? The chief rabbi. Suddenly he can make a decision, and you have now the arrogance, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish, of this billionaire class, that 6 or 7 or 8 people can decide what is permissible and indeed what is anti Semitic, and then what is anti logic, and what is anti reason, and what is anti human. They can make decisions. So if you bring up the history of the civil rights movement or slavery or what happened you talked about settler colonialism here,
Mm-hmm.
you talk about settler colonialism in the United States and its our history, that's another heresy, right? So they have the power to declare, and if they want to, they buy another presidential candidate. Hardly ever mention the role of this big money in the election of Trump. All the
Yeah.
talk about Citizens United and everything. Fact is, somebody can give you 300-400 million dollars at the last minute, a critical moment in a campaign, and you still claim to be a democracy. So I want to leave one last thought. It's an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
The hell, we can go on a little further. It gets to these labels of democracy
Yeah.
because it turns out, even in an extremely authoritarian regime, say Saudi Arabia, and I'm never been hesitant to make another criticism of Saudi Arabia, you know, dangerous theocracy, blah blah blah. Fact of the matter is, I forget his name, Solomon, the leader of Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
What
Bin
is it?
Solomon,
Yeah,
Ahmad bin Solomon. Yeah.
he was interviewed. I think it was by the Washington Post or somebody. They said, "Do you really care about the Palestinians and so forth? Is that really important to you?" And he said, "No, not really, but it is to my people." and that's a restraint. He said it openly. This was only a few months ago. You know, I have to think. In Egypt, even a dictator in Egypt has to think, yes, I don't like Hamas, but they come out of that Muslim Brotherhood. There are plenty of people in Egypt still believe there's an integrity to being Muslim of our fellow Muslims and so forth and so on. And Putin's Russia, he still has to worry. China's a very good example. They can't be indifferent.
Yeah.
To we have to feed our people. We can't. They have great fear in China. Going back to Confucius, you have to worry about the common good. This is Z's phrase now, the common prosperity. So there are restraints on every system, right? So that's not an American invention. That's reality, you know. And then when people rise up, like civil rights movement or so forth, it has an effect. So we've blurred these categories, and we're getting now under Trump a lot of people questioning in the world who has the secret sauce of democracy, right? Just because you have elections or you have different parties, but if they're controlled by the same powerful interests, this is a very live issue for the whole world. This is what the BRICS alliance is challenging, bringing together very strange coalition of countries that normally didn't get along, including China and India. Now, wait a minute, it's an open discussion.
Mhm.
So, let's just take it a little further as a scholar again. What do you think's happening internationally to these categories? And Palestine fits into it because, if the U.S. is associated with financing genocide, where is their authority to tell anybody in the world what they can do or not do? It,
Yeah.
it undercuts it fundamentally. You're going to tell me what should happen in Bolivia. You're going to tell me what should go on in Nepal or something. Who you? You paid for this thing. You paid, right, for this genocide.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's just one of the huge dangers of a policy of supporting, with no holds barred, the Israeli project and Israeli conduct is exactly like you can see things like the current genocide play out and just, completely shatter any semblance even of an illusion of there being some kind of a national order that everybody is adhering to, right? And there's several people have written about this, right? So, I forget the name of the author, but somebody wrote a piece. I think it was last year, maybe it was a little more than that, but essentially it was called "How Gaza Broke the International Rules-Based Order," something like that. Very something, some title like very explicit along those lines. Like we've seen that moment, and we've seen people really reckon and contend with that. Um, and so, given all of the intense sort of reversals that we saw Israel participate in. And even now that we supposedly have a ceasefire, we're still seeing kind of ongoing assaults, although obviously the scale is a little bit different from what we saw during, like, you know, different moments of the bombardment campaigns. There is still this question of, what is the broader damage in terms of the unraveling, in terms of international morale and a semblance of the kind of order of affairs that is opposed to seeing one state just engage so nakedly in genocide and, of course, like, aggression in terms of it's the other countries that are surrounding it in terms of this wanton bombardment, with no holds barred, and another country which is, the largest superpower in the world, writing a blank check and enabling that. What does that do? Of course, globally, people are going to start to have even more of this cynicism where they see that really nothing matters except for might is right, right? At the same time, the other check that you were mentioning does exist, right? There are, even if they're shrewder about it, as I think your question set up, there is a sense that internationally, publics really support the Palestinian struggle and are opposed to what's happening, and leaders to a certain extent, even as repressive as they can be, need to kind of have that awareness in terms of their international conduct. But to what extent do those things continue to act as a check, you know, um, is something that I think is being tested right now. We are going to see, like, even as Israel's already been violating it repeatedly, is the bulk of what we're looking at as the ceasefire right now going to hold? And if not, what does that mean? Not just for Palestinians, not just for Israel, not even just for the U.S., but for the world at large, because I think it's happening maybe a little bit too much in real time, but I do feel like we're at a very uncertain moment, to say the least, where a lot of the conventions of international diplomacy and the world order have basically, in a lot of ways, been rent asunder, even as parallel to that, you are having this broader reconfiguration of global power, right? Um, the US had banked for so long on being the economic and military superpower. And part of that, in large part, was also trying to be this kind of unchallenged tech giant. And I think some of the TikTok deal is precisely about that as well. Of course, it's about the political messaging, but it's also about the having this ascendancy in what is the hot industry in this moment, right? But it was only a matter of time before other countries would have their own capabilities to finally be able to catch up, to show some competition, and that's exactly where we're at. So um, I think we're seeing a reconfiguration of a lot of the things that we take it for granted. It's happening in real time. Um, I do think that, you know, hegemony isn't something that gets undone overnight. So I don't think we're going to see a slackening of the capacity for violence that we have from, the imperialism of the United States or its support for Israel. But I definitely do think we're also witnessing a reconfiguration of the global orders of power, and what that yields beyond the kind of intense retrenchment of power in terms of this kind of frantic trying to stop it from taking effect. I think that that is very much up in the air. um, and I'm certainly watching with bated breath, along with many of us, I'm sure.
You know, the great Jewish philosopher Leonard Cohen. No, I'm not really being totally sarcastic. I think there's a lot of wisdom in his lyrics.
Yeah, yeah, he's a
But he
brilliant
says
lyricist.
this line I love quoting: "There's a crack in everything. And that's how the light gets in." And he's not the first one to talk about contradictions producing change, dialectic and so forth. But I think we're clearly in that kind of world. It's very dangerous. It feels very dangerous, and a lot of people can get really hurt, or the planet can end. That's also in the offing here. But there's a crack, big
Yeah,
crack, many cracks, and a lot of people around the world, partially because of the new technology and social media, but everything else, and refugees, people moving physically, and everything else. You can't contain knowledge anymore.
right, right.
And that's what we saw at the UN. That's what we're seeing in the public awareness of what happens, what has been happening in Gaza and Israel. And so, on that note, I want to recommend your book, Terms of Servitude. I'm not going to give the whole long subtitle. I guess I will. Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestine Liberation Struggle. But as I've been saying for the last 53 minutes, this book is really about a much bigger theme. Not that the other theme isn't important, but a much bigger theme, which is whether this internet, which, as I've said and written about, is the best and worst of all worlds, is also contains this fundamental contradiction. Uh, no one's a hick on the farm anymore. The old saying, how do you keep them once they've seen Paris? How do you keep them ignorant, the poor, ignorant agrarian society? People are all within viewing distance now. They feel the consequence. They raise it, gives rise to right wing populism, gives rise to left wing populism, but it certainly creates a lot of fluidity in the situation. It's good that we have a few intellectuals of competence and knowledge like yourself who are not afraid to put it out there. Let's hope more get emboldened by this exercise of freedom. But that's it for this week's Sheer Intelligence. Again, thank you, Professor Omar Zahzah, and of the San Francisco State University. By the way, one of my favorite schools. Even though I did graduate work at Berkeley, I always thought SF State was where there was the real rebellion, not Berkeley. Uh, People of Berkeley were a little too willing to sell out compared to the more working class population of San Francisco State. So my hat's off to that institution. I also want to thank our executive producer, Joshua Shear, for putting this together. I know we missed a few dates to tape this, but I want to thank him for being persistent that you better do this day, even though I just came from the dentist. So I had another reason for postponing it, but I was really happy I didn't. And so I want to thank Diego Ramos, the managing editor of SharePost, for posting these, and for Max Jones for posting on the video, editing it, the video. See you next week, or see you in a few days. There's so much to report on. I'm doing these things now 2-3 times a week rather than once a week. And Sheer Intelligence on SharePost and on Apple, Spotify, everywhere else that you can find these things. And see you next time.